difficult to see how Biden can retain the presidency. So this question about what's happening in Palestine right now is really having reverberations throughout the world, whether it's in Western Europe or the United States.
Yeah, and going back to the sort of propaganda machine that's going in overdrive right now on behalf of Western powers, can you talk a bit about other players, like, for instance, this Visegrad 24, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but what's their whole role? Because obviously they're just going for the whole line without equivocation.
Yeah, I mean, we're living in a really mediated age, and what I mean by that is that these wars are playing out not only on the battlefield in the Middle East, in Western Asia, perhaps we should call it more accurately, but they're also happening across our screens and our laptops and generally in cyberspace. And one of the most interesting things that's happened is that as everybody's attention is actually focused upon Israel and Palestine, there have been so many groups popping up trying to exploit this attention and trying to push narratives in certain directions. Everybody's got a bias, so I'm not saying that I want some unbiased news about Israel-Palestine. I don't really think that's possible. But one group that's really come to the fore is Visegrad 24, which was only started a few years ago as a social media platform. They don't even have a website, but they talk about themselves as a news aggregator. And they have become phenomenally influential in manipulating and influencing the debate online. Visegrad 24 presents itself as a sort of neutral arbiter of news about the Middle East. However, what I found when I studied them was actually that they are quietly funded by the far-right government of Poland, who are very supportive of Israel. And when you actually look at what Visegrad's content comes out, you see that immediately throughout their thing. It's just wall-to-wall propaganda, demonizing Muslims, demonizing Palestinians, and lionizing the apartheid state of Israel. And they're not exactly, it would be one thing if they just took a pro-Israel bent on the news, but unfortunately what makes them so problematic is that they just constantly put out so much demonstrably and ludicrously fake news that it really should undermine their entire platform. Somehow it doesn't, though. So, for example, they published a long video which they presented as a Palestinian man condemning Hamas and saying, it's all Hamas's fault. However, this man is actually an Israeli comedian, which anyone in Israel should probably know. And yet this was presented as, this Palestinian man going against Hamas. And of course, this represents what the Palestinian people really think, etc., etc. They're on Israel's side. They've also been caught just ludicrously appropriating videos taken by Palestinian journalists showing Israeli crimes and then saying this was actually Hamas doing this. And they've been called out constantly, time and time again. And yet it doesn't seem to hurt their views or their ratings or their algorithm score, because they go from strength to strength. In fact, there was one study of the most important and most influential accounts on X, formerly Twitter, with regard to Israel-Palestine, and Visegrad 24 came out as the #1 most important and influential account there, which is really surprising given the fact that it seems to be run by a bunch of faceless people from Eastern Europe, and that they're funded by a government source, and that they constantly push out just completely and utterly false information. But unfortunately, that's the world we're living in, that they always say that in war, truth is the first casualty, and it's no different on social media as well.
I think we're living through this time where it's weaponized more than ever. I mean, you have this new pervasive way to communicate with people. And of course, there used to be rules against journalists saying false things on, mainstream things. But now the door is open where people like me can just get on with a microphone and spread whatever I want. So it's a double-edged sword in that way. But are we seeing the tide turn? Obviously, this is the historical context of this goes way back before October 7th, and you guys have been at MintPress at least talking about it for a long time. Do you think the tide is turning as far as people understanding the true nature of this conflict?
Well, sometimes it's a little bit difficult to tell these things in the moment, but we are seeing significantly more people across the world taking up the Palestinian position, particularly young people, people really getting interested in what's going on, people not really believing what they're hearing on corporate media or in the newspapers or wherever. Definitely there has been this long, slow shift towards less support for Israel and more sensitivity and solidarity with Palestine in the Western world, particularly in the United States. And we see that in new polls that came out. Net favorability, for instance, I'm talking about this Time poll, which came out last month. Net favorability of Israel across the world dropped by an average of 18.5 points between September and December, which is just enormous considering it was only a few months. We've seen Israel, for example, their net favorability in Japan went from negative 39 to negative 62. And even countries like the United Kingdom, Israel's net favorability is now negative 30. So it's got a 30-point deficit there, which is just extraordinary. The US, a little bit less so. Israel is still very popular there. But ultimately, across the world, when we talk about the entire population, most of the world sees this conflict or this occupation for what it is. If you go across Africa, Latin America, Asia, most of these countries really have a much more clear-eyed view of the conflict than people in the West do. And I think that's probably because they're not just bombarded with propaganda all the time. One interesting aspect of the whole battle for ideas that's going on is that when you really break down who in the West is supporting Israel and who is supporting the Palestinian position more, you see younger people are far, far more likely to be sensitive and awake to the suffering of the Palestinian people, while older people are very much stuck in the dyed-in-the-wool Israel supporters. And I think that's really down to what sort of media that you consume. Older people, in general, very much use cable news, very much still in the old media of newspapers, print, of radio, etc. And these are still dominated by these old institutions which have been around for decades, if not centuries. And they're basically pushing the same line as you have seen for decades on Israel-Palestine, that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, that it's defending itself from Palestinian terrorism, and we have to support Israel. But the situation is very different on social media. People who get their news from TikTok or Twitter or Instagram, or even people who are not very political at all, it's very hard not to have seen so many just devastating, disgusting, upsetting videos of the barbarity of what's going on during this genocide, which has been going on for months now. So if you're exposed to that on a daily basis, it's very hard not to see that and feel sympathy and feel outrage, because, after all, we're empathetic human beings. And so if you're being exposed to that, which you will be more likely, at least if you're using social media, then you're naturally going to move and gravitate towards a sort of more anti-occupation stance. The powers that be, the elites, are very worried about this. They do not want young people starting to revolt over what their governments are helping fund. And so we are now seeing so many more people in think tanks and big political parties talking about the need to regulate the internet. We've heard so much about how TikTok is apparently full of anti-Semitic memes or, pro-China, anti-Israel content. This is all a sort of an excuse to try and retighten control over the means of communication, because ultimately, even though there are so many flaws with social media in terms of who can actually get their message out, what sort of accounts get promoted and what sort of accounts get defunded and pushed to the side or deranked or whatever, there is still some semblance of democracy in terms of what gets seen. And that's very dangerous to the powers that be, who really need to keep a tight lid on what's going on in Israel-Palestine, because ultimately I'm convinced that if everybody did see the truth of what was going on, virtually nobody would support this. And hopefully, with social media continuing to become the dominant form of communication worldwide, hopefully that trend can continue, and we will see this as a sort of tipping point, the tipping point where Israel could no longer act with complete impunity and with no consequence. And it was the tipping point towards the time when the world decided that actually the West might not have their best interests at heart and maybe they should go their own way.
Yeah. Do you think that there is some chance that social media itself, obviously we've seen a higher ratio of Palestinian, things that are happening to Palestinians more than we saw anything about what Israel is claiming, they're killing so many people. In reality, we see that Palestinians are truly the oppressed ones. Do you think that'll put the nail in the coffin of sort of imperialist, sort of this realpolitik American style of doing things, kill everybody, ask questions later? Do you think that we could move towards a more diplomatic world with the help of, these videos that we see the truth with our own eyes?
Well, I guess that depends on whether those videos or that information really spurs Western publics, particularly the American public, into political action. If it just inspires disgust and apathy and people don't really get involved in politics or, just kind of drop out, then I don't think it's actually going to have that effect. However, if we do see these issues really energizing people and convincing them to get involved in politics, pushing pressure on elected representatives, putting pressure on businesses who conduct trade with the state of Israel, then actually that could have a very positive effect, and it might be a stepping stone towards a better future. Maybe what we're seeing right now is the United States is starting to lose control economically of the world. Back in 1945, the United States had literally half the world's wealth. The other industrial powers like the Soviet Union or Germany or United Kingdom or France were completely destroyed. China had been destroyed over 200 years or at least 100 years of colonialism, India 200 years. And so the United States was in this completely dominant economic position, meaning that it could really do what it wanted politically, economically, militarily. However, as that situation has started to change a little bit, particularly with the rise of Asian countries like China and to a lesser extent India, we're seeing the United States is no longer really the unquestionable number one power economically. China, if you look at maps, now is the largest trading partner of a plurality of countries around the world. The United States no longer has that position where it's this dominant manufacturing power. In fact, when you look at what the United States actually exports, a lot of it is just nonsense that really we don't need. It's like financial stuff, or it's stuff like
derivatives, yes.
or, Netflix, like Wall Street stuff, or rentier economies like Microsoft Word or something. The stuff that actually could get replaced very easily. Whereas China is actually making, or not just China, but Asian countries are actually making tangible products that we need and want and that are important for society. And so as we move forward into the 21st century, we might see the United States being constrained a little bit in that respect. However, one aspect where the United States is still unquestionably number one is with its military. It has the strongest military in the world. It spends almost as much as the rest of the world combined on arms, on weapons. It can still project power in that sense. And the really worrying thing that I think will really come to dominate the 21st century is how the United States manages that economic decline while still being a military superpower. The worry is that while economically it might be declining, it might try to keep control over as much of the world as possible through its military, meaning that there might actually be a chance that there'll be more military endeavors, more invasions, more conquests, more wars of exploitation than we saw in the late 20th. That's certainly not something I want to see, but it's most definitely something that could happen if things fall into place in the right way.
I think you brought up a good point, Alan. Now you just scared the hell out of me. Can you talk a little bit about the role of South Korea and Japan at the moment, and also in terms of the failing hegemony of the United States? I mean, the United States is going down in flames. How many of its Asian partners is it going to drag down with it?
Very interesting question. South Korea and Japan emerged after World War II out of the complete wreckage of their societies as some of the poorest places in the world, and within one generation had made it to the point where these places had actually entered the first world in terms of being advanced economies. However, they still are very much under the control of the United States politically. Japan has more or less been a one-party state in terms of who's actually controlling the country since the 1950s. The LDP, as it's called, the Liberal Democratic Party, was started with the help of the CIA, which funded it for many, many years to get it up on its feet. And it's still very much the dominant force in Japanese politics. Likewise, with Korea, we've seen huge presence of the United States in that country, controlling the sort of political outlook of the place. The US has tens of thousands of troops. Last time I checked was 50,000 in South Korea. They, of course, invaded the Korean Peninsula in the Korean War, and they haven't left. Likewise, in Japan, the United States invaded in World War II. They have not left. The United States has over 100 military bases in Japan and many dozens more in Korea. And what these have really been used for in the last 10 years or so is they are the center point, the focal point of the Obama administration, and then later Trump and Biden's pivot to Asia, whereby in the early 2010s, US war planners realized that the Middle East was not so much the most strategic place in the world anymore, and they were very worried about the economic rise of China. And so what they started to do was move their forces towards East Asia. We've seen a ring of 300 to 400 military bases, depending on who you ask, encircling China from everywhere from, as we were saying, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Guam, Australia, over into Western Asia with places like Afghanistan as well. And the whole point is trying to delay China's rise, or at best suffocate it so it doesn't rise. But that's not really happening as the United States has hoped. China has gone from being a manufacturer of very cheap, low-tech products in the late 20th century, where we used to get our textiles and our toys from, to the point where it's actually one of the manufacturing superpowers in terms of high-tech industry, making semiconductors. It's the world leader in green transport like electric vehicles or high-speed rail. Solar panel production in China is beyond anything that Europe or the United States has been able to produce. And so China's really looking at being this economic powerhouse. And not only that, the countries around China have actually managed to grow and prosper because of that. Countries in Southeast Asia have seen their trade with China absolutely boom, and that's helped their economies. I'm thinking specifically of places like Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, all the countries in ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. This would certainly benefit South Korea and Japan if they could come to some sort of peaceful, neutral economics agreements with China. Japan and South Korea both have very highly educated populations. There are tens of millions of workers in both countries who could be doing very important jobs and stuff that could really make their countries prosper. But because the United States still has that overwhelming economic and political control over these two countries and keeps them on a relatively tight leash, this just hasn't happened. And so Japan, which was the second largest economy in the world in the 1980s, was a place where people were prospering, hasn't really seen any sort of serious GDP growth or economic growth in 30 years. The United States came in the late 80s and really kneecapped the economy, forcing Japan to sign all sorts of onerous trade deals with the US, which really took the legs out underneath its own semiconductor industry production, and also just the production of its high-tech high-tech sector in general. So we're seeing a lot of Japanese companies that we associate with, like, the electronics industry, really struggling right now. And, it's not really entirely clear whether all of them will survive. So I would say it really, East Asia does have a choice here. And the clear economic choice would be to grow closer to China economically while maintaining a sort of neutral stance. But the United States, as I mentioned, really does not want that to happen. The United States does not want to see its position as top dog being undermined and it just becoming an important regional player in the world. They don't really want that. They want to remain the unquestioned number one. And so they are, as your question suggested, trying to drag South Korea, Japan, Australia, countries like that along with them for better or worse. And, what you said, not just dragging them along, but they might eventually be dragging them down if the 21st century becomes the Asian century, which so many people are suggesting.